When we did and XP a couple of years ago, she was the first person to sign up and get a ticket. And she was the first person to show up on the day for the conference really early in the morning. You were, in fact, I think you left to go get Starbucks because nothing was open. And, she is such a great influence in tech and somebody who certainly inspired me. We think a lot about the same things, and I'm just so proud of the direction that all of her things are taking, and her Twitter threads are life-changing. I don't know anybody who's so good at Twitter threads. I cannot make my thoughts that coherent. Anyway, as we know, there was a world-shaking Twitter thread that was this argument with Bob Martin. I'm not calling him my uncle. It's just not happening. So I'd like to introduce Sarah May to give her talk on the power in Agile. Let's give it up for Sarah.
Power. This is what happens when you search Flickr Creative Commons for power. So please endorse me on LinkedIn for Twitter threads, thank you. If I can get that above Ruby programming, I will be pretty happy. So, this has been a pretty great day. No? Okay. Just checking. All right. The first thing I want to do actually is say thanks to Marlena. Thank you, Marlena. I had to stay on brand and turn your picture chartreuse. But she's, as she has mentioned, the main organizer of this conference. It is her brainchild, and it's been such a marvelous experience. And a conference like this is not an easy thing to run. I mean, it looks like, you show up in the space, and there's some chairs, and then you move people around. But it's a huge job, and she has a real job as well, writing code, so there's that. So I just want to take a moment to be appreciative of Marlena and the community that she's created here with this conference. So, thank you. I also want to say thanks to the sponsors. I run conferences as well, so this is something I always do. I don't know how many of you know how a conference budget is usually organized, but if you're an organizer and you want to break even on just selling tickets, you'd probably have to charge 3 or 4 times what the ticket prices are. And so the way that you keep it reasonable and also be able to offer things like discounts and scholarships and such are by getting companies such as these folks to sponsor the conference. So in a very real sense, these folks are contributing money to foster community. They probably also want to hire you. So please talk to them about that. And I do also appreciate them enabling Marlena to bring this community together. So that's pretty awesome. Thank you, sponsors. So the first thing I'd like to do is introduce you to my current team. I am currently a software architect at the design systems team at Salesforce, part of the user experience group. This is all of user experience. We use this photo a lot internally, which I have mixed feelings about. They got everybody in the UX group matching ugly holiday sweaters. They're actually very nicely knit sweaters. They were designed by someone in the group. It's sort of like working in pixel art, So they had to put us all, I had all of us put them on to take a photo. And here's me, over here on the side, looking kind of confused. So to give you some context, this was week 2, I believe, of my new job. And at this point in the proceedings, we had already taken the normal photo. And the photographer said, okay, we're going to take the wacky photo. And so I was like, oh shit, what does wacky look like in a work context? And as I went through that thought process in my head, that's when they took the picture. So apparently I'm just going to be perpetually confused in every internal presentation we do until next November when they give us a new set of sweaters, I guess. I don't know. So this is a pretty big team. It's one of the most diverse teams that I've ever worked on. And I'd like to introduce you now to a different team. And that is you, the team in this room, these folks that you've been talking to and eating with and sitting next to and standing near all day. This room is more diverse than my team, more diverse than any team that I have ever worked on. And all of us do software for a living. And we're here on a Saturday, when we could be home sleeping or playing Stardew Valley, because we think software is important to do right. And so finally, I'd like to introduce you to a third team. These are the 17 people who signed the Agile Manifesto, which is the document that kicked off modern software development in 2001. These people created the document that all of our Agile practices, including pair programming, which comes from XP, are based on. Kent Beck, in the upper left, formulated the ideas around pair programming and the rest of extreme programming as his interpretation of the Agile Manifesto. Bob Martin, who has come up many times today, also has his interpretation of the Agile Manifesto, which he calls software craftsmanship. And there are various other flavors, as you well know. So what do you notice that's different about this team versus the other two that we have looked at, besides the disturbing lack of Salesforce-themed holiday sweaters? And the fact that there's like 17 of them, which is a really hard number to try and figure out how to display. So the obvious question, right? Where are the people of color in this picture? Where are the white women? Where are other gender minorities? Where is anybody else, really, in this picture? Software development is ultimately about organizing people to do creative work. Does anyone think that a process to organize people to do creative work made by these people is going to work for us in this room? Or even for these folks? I mean, I feel like we could send those 17 dudes sweaters, but that's not really the problem here. I worked with a lot of different teams. In fact, while I was putting this talk together, I realized that I took my first professional programming job in August 1998, and here we are. It's almost August 2018. And I've been a software developer for 20 years. So I am expecting a trophy in the mail at some point. Someone's going to, I don't know. There's somebody who's keeping track of this stuff, right? But for the first 10 years of my career, I wrote a lot of code that never went anywhere, that was attached to products that didn't ship, or was attached to initiatives that never really did anything, and no one ever used. And for the first 10 years or so that I wrote code, every 6 months I was like clockwork, I got bored with my job. And I kind of figured that I really just wasn't cut out for programming. And then, of course, everything changed. But it didn't really, right? It's funny, right, how the human brain loves to make stories out of everything, and your own history in particular. Your brain really, really wants it to fit into a narrative, as though you knew all along what you were doing, had a plan, everything you were doing was just driving towards the plan. In reality, I don't really think anybody is like that. I think we're all just making it up as we go along. And if we're going for a more realistic version of the story, it's more like, and then I accidentally took a job that was good for me. And I say accidentally because at this point I knew I wasn't enjoying the work I was doing, but I didn't know what a good job even looked like. I figured the problem was me. That it was my fault. I clearly wasn't very good at programming because I wasn't very good at any of these jobs. But programming pays pretty well, and the first 6 months are always fun. And I had a family at that point, so I kept going until one day I just kind of stumbled into something awesome. And that was at Pivotal Labs around 2009. And what I discovered when I got there was that all the stuff that I had been calling Agile, or that other places that I had worked had called Agile, really weren't anything about Agile. At the time, Pivotal did the following sets of things. They did 100% test-driven development. They did 1-week iterations. They did continuous integration at a time before Travis CI, when this was actually a fairly challenging thing to do. They did daily pair rotation. They did a fixed 9 to 6 schedule, and this was in the days when many companies, even large ones, often expected you to come early and stay late and work the weekends. And they did 100% pair programming. This is everything the Agile Manifesto wanted. This is everything Kent Beck wanted, for sure. This really wasn't what I cared about. Here's what I cared about. We actually built the right thing more often than by random chance. We actually shipped code like all the time. It was a normal thing. Some of the things that I wrote were actually useful. Some of it was actually meaningful. And by meaningful, I don't mean that Pivotal's clients were any more virtuous than any of the random startups I'd worked for, but it was just that instead of running out of money and fizzling out and sort of dispersing their disappointed employees back into the job market with nothing really gained, these companies still ran out of money, but at least they learned something first. Because all of these practices are explicitly designed to supercharge and maximize learning and output. And I just loved it. Oh my God, I loved working that way. I loved it so much that I became a pretty strong advocate for these practices, as you might know, particularly pair programming, in my talks, in my blog posts, and on Twitter, which if you'll notice, you search for Twitter Sarah May pair programming, there's like 6,500 results. I believe it. I haven't counted. And for a long time, the way I thought about this was, why wouldn't everyone want to work this way? Right? If they didn't want to work this way, maybe they were lazy. Maybe they didn't want all this visibility into their work because they really weren't doing good work, or maybe they were playing Stardew Valley all day, who knows? And I don't think I ever really said that they were lazy out loud, but I think I thought it for a number of years. But while this was happening, there were distant rumblings, ominous clouds on the horizon. Here are some examples of those clouds. When I started at Pivotal Labs, there were 45 developers in the San Francisco office. 43 of them were men. The other woman was an intern who'd started just a few weeks before me. Almost everyone I worked with was white. I don't recall a single African-American engineer the entire time I was there. Several friends from the LGBTQIA community who worked there struggled. I volunteered with Hackbright Academy, which was a code school for women here in San Francisco, the first years it operated. The curriculum director told me they had initially centered the curriculum around pairing, but the students didn't like doing it. Many people I greatly respected in the community, many of whom are members of some marginalized group, say they don't like it either. They don't like pair programming. A woman I mentored, after we'd had a couple of beers one evening, told me like it was a confession that she hated it. And at some level, this just did not compute for me. I loved it. For me, pair programming is a set of attention hacks. It's easy for me to focus when I'm talking to somebody, and it feels like being forced to route my thoughts through my mouth, in addition to through my fingers, allows me to learn and to understand and to be able to articulate things better over time. There are some issues with pair programming that come up a lot, or with sort of the XP practices in general. I consider these sort of a set of standard issues that people run into. Things like talking 8 hours a day is hard. Fixed schedule is difficult for a lot of people. People have different motivations for writing code. Not everyone has the same motivation I do. Time zones are difficult. Distributed teams or split teams is a difficult thing to deal with. Many of these issues do come up in conversation in the Agile community, and many of them can be solved by using small a Agile, despite the fact that I'm using all caps. So by small a Agile, I mean not Scrum or Kanban or XP, just Agile, right? You start with a prescribed set of practices from one of these groups, perhaps, but then you don't stick to them if they're not working. And many of those standard issues can be solved in this way, because every practice has something it's trying to accomplish, and there's always other ways to accomplish those things. So to give you a simple example, let's talk about time zones. Although as we know, I think as programmers, nothing about time zones is ever easy. So one of the issues with distributed teams are things like meetings, which Neha mentioned this morning. You can't do a daily stand-up at 9:07 a.m. if everyone's 9:07 a.m. is actually a different time. So we think about, okay, well, what is the stand-up meeting actually trying to accomplish? And it's some set of these, right? We're trying to align the team for the day. Maybe we're trying to reduce siloing by exposing knowledge amongst the team. Maybe we're trying to increase efficiency by having people surface problems earlier. And there are other practices that will accomplish all of these things. If you want to align the team for the day, you could do that in a Slack channel. There are other ways that one can align the team rather than, besides all being in a circle, standing up, talking to each other. And when I was doing this kind of work, the resistance that I felt to some of these changes, when stand-up wouldn't work, for example, is that it's not as efficient for me, personally, to read and write information than it is to speak it. And so sometimes, especially when I was at Pivotal, it seemed like the answer was, well, let's just do stand-up at 9:07 and everyone will just show up then, right? No distributed teams, no altered timing for parents or people with other caregiving responsibilities, all in the name of efficiency, which translates to higher velocity. So that's a simple example, right? There's multiple ways that you can go about it. And it's simple because there are ways to alter the practices that will alleviate the issue while continuing to allow the team to do some of the other practices. But let's look at a more complex case. Let's look at different motivations. People have different motivations, it turns out, for doing software development work. I mentioned earlier that I'm motivated by having my code get out in the world and make a difference in somebody's life. I want to feel like my work is a net positive on the world. Shockingly, not everybody thinks exactly like me. Some people are motivated by pushing the frontiers of what's possible by a more researchy-oriented code. Some people are motivated by being in the solo flow state, or they're motivated by the ability or the opportunity to use new technology. Now, I used to think that I didn't want to work with people like that I wanted to work with people who, like me, wanted to just get great software out the door and into the hands of real people. And that's what Agile and extreme programming is designed for. And that's probably why I love it so much. But the Agile community's reaction to these people who have motivations different from that is to say things like, well, don't hire them, or fire them, or make them do the stuff anyway. Or perhaps at its least pathological expression, move them off your team. Maybe they'd be happy prototyping stuff for the marketing team or something. Agile's unwillingness to work with people who have other motivations is its greatest weakness. And I say that it's the greatest weakness that they know about. Meaning it's the greatest weakness that is acknowledged in the Agile community. And by that, I mean it's the greatest weakness that is acknowledged by these guys. Because apparently there are lots of white men who are not motivated by shipping code. And these white men in the picture are happy to acknowledge that and have a conversation with these other white men about how they fit into the landscape. But of course, these white men think they're correct still. And they still think everyone else should be fired or moved to less important work, or, hey, have you thought about being a manager? And if there is such diversity in motivation amongst white men, it seems really obvious to me that once you have a team that isn't all white men, you'll find even more diversity of motivation and diversity of everything else as well. And what bothers me about this is that the XP canon produces such groupthink that it can't even handle the diversity of the full spectrum of white men. Which, then you gotta wonder, right? Well, why is it that people from marginalized communities struggle to find a foothold there? If you were listening to Twitter, which I don't necessarily recommend, they might tell you that what this shows us is that XP does nothing to do with race or gender or marginalization at all, because if we're excluding large swaths of white men, then how can it be racist? Or sexist or ableist? And this is literally the argument that much of the Agile community still makes when I talk about this topic. And the form of these arguments is often something like, well, extreme programming practices aren't racist or sexist, but they do exclude people who have caregiving responsibilities, or people whose home lives aren't handled by a stay-at-home spouse, or anyone whose attention needs to be elsewhere at any time during the day. It's just an accident, they tell me, that that those groups include basically everyone in all the marginalized communities, because hey, there's a bunch of white men in those groups too. And that's bullshit. So I'm just gonna say it. Extreme programming practices are racist, sexist, and ableist at minimum. And we haven't, as an industry, tried very hard to fix it. Unintentional exclusion becomes intentional when you don't fix it. And the real problems, I think we all know in this room, are deeper than the practices. The real problem here is power. So let's talk about power dynamics. Now, I have to warn you that once you start seeing them, you'll see them everywhere. At least that's been my experience. So a power dynamic is a behavior in an interaction that is driven by a hierarchical relationship between the participants. So that hierarchical relationship could be a formal one, such as manager-report or senior-junior, but more often it is informal, a hierarchy based on race, gender, or background. And the behaviors that these produce tend to be things like interaction difficulties, people being talked over, people in the lower power situation being talked over, or not feeling empowered to contribute at the level of the person of the higher power does. Informal power dynamics tend to mimic the form of structural oppression. So power dynamics that are based on characteristics that have historically been subject to structural oppression turn around and mimic that structural hierarchy, right? So in this situation, men are more powerful than other genders, white people are more powerful than other races, and so forth. And note that more powerful in this context, it doesn't really mean any kind of formal power, but it's more about being empowered to contribute to the conversation. The power I'm talking about mostly manifests itself as the ability to ignore the dynamic completely. People on the upward side of a power dynamic are free to pretend that the dynamic does not exist. And indeed, oftentimes as children, that's what they're told to do, right? Don't see color, don't see gender. And even as adults, sometimes we get messages that suggest ignoring power dynamics is the right way to go. Like you can go to the self-help section of a bookstore, if there were any bookstores left in the world, and you would see shelves full of books that recommend that women who work in business situations should tell the men to treat them the same way that they, the men, treat other men. The trouble with ignoring a power dynamic when you're on the upward side of it is that in doing so, you reinforce it. Even though in many situations, like pair programming, what you really want to do is neutralize it. You want to create a situation where both halves of the pair feel empowered to contribute equally to the conversation. But when you're on the upward side of a power dynamic, it's up to you. You need to take active action to level that playing field. Because due to that inherent nature of those power dynamics, you're the one that's on the uphill side of the soccer pitch, right? And they're the ones that are running uphill. It looks flat to you, and you find it no problem to run down. But if you're asking them to run up, it's not going to work. And on the upward side of the power dynamic, you're both more powerful and you're better resourced. And it really is your moral responsibility, in my opinion. And ignoring or denying the tilt of the field is not going to help you, because asking people to both walk uphill and figure out how to distribute the power is not going to work. Now, in any given pair of people who are going to work together for the day, multiple power dynamics are in play. And figuring out who is most powerful is not only pointless, it's kind of impossible. You can't just sum them, right? Just like with oppression generally, of which this is a tiny piece, power dynamics are intersectional. So let's go over some common power dynamics that you would find in pair programming situations. These are low to high. So very common one, junior developer, senior developer. There's a whole class of things that are sort of the wrong background and the right background. So whether that's self-taught or boot camp or computer science degree, or sometimes in startups it's reversed and the CS degree is the wrong background, it depends. The person who is learning the code and the person who is teaching the code, so it could be that someone is showing you around their code, or they're showing you around a type of code base that they're very familiar with. There's feminine, masculine, very common one. people of color, white folks, women and other genders and men, disabled and able-bodied folks. I want to say this again because I think it's important. The power dynamics are intersectional. And these problems are hard. It's hard to figure out from minute to minute how things are shifting and whether or not the person you're talking with feels empowered or feels a power differential. So I have a couple of suggestions. The first one is that the more dynamics you are on the upward side of, the more you should take cues from your pair. So let them speak first, be mindful of interrupting, catch your reactions to their words on the way out, and do post-processing pass, right, to consider whether you would have that same reaction if someone who looks more like you had said it. Think ahead of time about what dynamics might exist, and think really carefully about where you are relative to each other in those dynamics. And of course, because they are dynamics, that doesn't mean that means that they are constantly changing. The list that I just went over is a good start. There's many other power dynamics to consider, such as national origin, visa status, native language, external signs of religion, editor preference. Seriously, I'm an IDE user, and you wouldn't imagine the stuff I've heard from Vim users. There's also preferred language. I feel like especially in the Ruby community, we like to look down on Java programmers and PHP developers. Location in the stack, I'll get into that a bit more in a moment. And there's also role, right? Developers tend to place themselves above designers, for example, which means that as a developer, even if you personally don't think that designers are less worthy or less valuable than developers, when you're pairing with a designer, that's something to keep in mind. I've been showing this comic to a lot of audiences lately. Do we have any recovering academics in the room? We have a few. In academia, there is a hierarchy of purity in the fields that starts with sociologists and goes up to psychologists who are like, yeah, it's just applied psychology. And then the biologists are like, yeah, it's just applied biology. The chemists are like, well, your thing is just applied chemistry. The physicist is like, well, that's just applied physics. And then all the way over on the side, we've got the mathematicians who's like, hey, how's it going over there? And of course, we have one of those in tech, right? Ours maybe starts with the UX folks. Then we go to the HTML and CSS folks. Then we go to the JavaScript people. Then we have the backend people. Then we have the infrastructure people. And then all the way over on the side, we have like the machine learning AI people who are like, hey, over there, I'm just hanging out. And this is really prestige, right? It's less about purity, perhaps, in our world, and more about prestige, which in a capitalist society, of course, corresponds to average salary. And I think you can quibble with the order of things up here or object to the fact that I didn't include security or QA, but I don't think anyone's going to argue with me when I say that there is a hierarchy and that it's internalized to a certain degree in all of us. And this is something that we need to keep in mind when we're considering power dynamics. So that's the second thing. The third thing is what to do when your pair doesn't reciprocate. So if you find yourself in a situation when a pair is talking over you or assuming their way is always correct or has reactions that would be different with someone else, one way to neutralize that, if it's available, is to find another power dynamic that you're on the upward side of and demonstrate that to them. I used to do this a lot with men when I paired with, when they were dismissive, usually because they hadn't worked with me before. I come from a fairly traditional computer science background, and I know all the computer science stuff just cold, even though I haven't used it in 20 years. I loved it in school. It was amazing. It was such a great little perfect world of everything fit together. And so a lot of times when I would pair with people, they would make assumptions about my background. And I would casually say something that would change their mind about that. And so I would ask also that if you find yourself on the unexpectedly sort of on the receiving end of one of those comments, to sort of take that as an opportunity to go, oh shit, am I doing that thing where I'm dominating too much, right? Try standing down, try listening more. If someone's trying to engage you in a contest like that, kind of double down on care rather than engaging. Now, often an avenue of demonstration like that isn't always available, right? There may legitimately be no power dynamics that work in that direction, or there may be no way to demonstrate them. And so now we come to why pair programming is difficult on a heterogeneous team, because Agile doesn't have anything to say about this. Agile takes as one of its fundamental core principles, unstated of course, that everyone involved feels as empowered to contribute as everyone else. Agile ignores power dynamics. Because they can. Ultimately, it is up to us to redefine this. Because there is a lot of power in the Agile practices. But right now, it's not accessible to everybody. But we can change that. I don't know what the answer is. That's why I'm here. But we can make this thing ours. We're the ones who are here doing it. Right? We're not the museum pieces still writing books. We're actually doing it. This is our field. This is where we live, and we can do this. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. This talk has been so long in coming, and it just passed. We have chips and guacamole. We have some tacos. We also have some other food on the way. I am setting up the catering right now, so give it like 5 minutes, and then we can have some food. So the paint night is set up, and when you go in there, go and get your spot. So pick up a canvas. Gonna suggest the middle 2 tables for now. Folks who want minimal interaction, table at the front, closest to the container. And yeah, so go get your canvas, pick your spot. Notice if you can see the front, if you can see the reference painting. If it looks like it's obstructed because of a post, might want to pick another seat. I guess I should go ahead and do a little closing remark about Pear Conf itself. Thanks for showing up. You all have shown up in an amazing way. And all of those things that Sarah was saying, because I was totally listening, they're all true. There's no museum. We're living in the Museum of Experience. So I hope that y'all take the lessons from today and we'll find something that you think you want to change on Monday. And thanks so much for coming. We're going to tell that Bob Martin, he's not our uncle. Thanks. Let's go get some chips and guacamole.